The morning sun filtered through the chain-link fencing that surrounded the compound, casting striped shadows across the ground where Aya Tanaka found herself kneeling just a few weeks later. Her hands worked carefully in the dark soil, tending to the delicate shoots of lettuce that had begun to emerge in the garden plot the women had been allowed to cultivate. The garden itself was arranged in orderly rows that stretched before her, a sight that continued to provoke wonder each time she looked at it, because who would have imagined that prisoners of war would be permitted, much less encouraged, to grow vegetables for their own consumption? Back in Tokyo, before the war had pulled her away from her old life, she had stood before classrooms full of children and taught them from textbooks that were filled with images designed to make them fear and hate everything American. Those textbooks had shown Americans as barbaric monsters without culture or compassion, and she had dutifully transmitted those lessons to young minds that absorbed them like soil absorbing rain. Yet here she was now, on her knees in soil provided by her captors, tending plants with tools that had been given to her freely, while guards walked their regular patrols along the perimeter and occasionally stopped to ask if the women needed anything. One particular guard had become a familiar presence during these garden sessions, a man named O'Connor, whose weathered face suggested he was somewhere in his 40s, and whose manner with the women was consistently courteous, without being condescending. On this particular morning, he approached the garden carrying a wooden crate that appeared to contain additional gardening implements, better quality than what they had been using up until that point. Aya looked up at him as he set the crate down, and she spoke with the kind of directness that sometimes made the other women uncomfortable, because it seemed to court trouble to question the guards too openly. "Why do you give us these things?" she asked in English that was grammatically correct but carried the rhythms of her native Japanese beneath the foreign words. O'Connor simply nodded at her question as though it was perfectly reasonable to ask, which perhaps it was. He replied that a garden grows better when you give it proper tools, and that his mother had always told him you cannot expect much from a plant if you refuse to give it what it needs to thrive. He set the crate down with care, as though the tools inside were valuable rather than simple implements, and then he continued on his patrol without making a fuss about his small act of consideration. Later in the day, when the women had returned to the shade to rest from their work in the garden, their conversation naturally turned to the previous evening's meal. A woman named Midori Saito had actually saved half of her portion of white bread, wrapping it carefully in a handkerchief, despite her two young sons protesting that they were completely full and did not need her to save food for them later. The sheer abundance of food still felt impossible to accept as real, because their memories of Shanghai during those final desperate months before evacuation were still vivid and painful. In Shanghai, a single slice of bread had been treasure enough to fight over, something worth risking injury to obtain, and now they were being given more food than they could eat in a single sitting. An older woman named Fumiko, who had worked as a clerk in a government office before the war, began to talk about the peanut butter, her voice dropping to a whisper as though discussing something faintly scandalous. She said it tasted like sweetness and salt combined in a way she had never experienced before, that the texture and flavour were completely foreign to anything in her previous experience. Aya found herself thinking about her daughter Mariko, who had been left behind in Kyoto with her grandmother when Aya had been sent to China for work, and she wondered how she could possibly describe any of this in her letters home. The letters were carefully examined and censored by camp officials before being sent, so she had to be cautious about what she wrote. But even beyond the censorship, there was the problem of finding words for experiences that seemed to defy language. How could she explain that their captors fed them meat every single day, that there was milk available for the children, and it was real milk rather than the watered-down or rice powder extended substitute they had grown accustomed to during the war? The words felt dangerous even when they existed only in her thoughts, as though acknowledging good treatment somehow made her a traitor to her nation. That afternoon brought another activity that had become part of their routine, English lessons conducted in a makeshift classroom that O'Connor had somehow managed to equip with actual chalkboards and boxes of white chalk. Aya stood at the front of a small group of women, teaching them phrases that might help them communicate more effectively with the guards and camp staff. She was aware of the irony inherent in teaching the language of the enemy to women who had been raised to resist everything that language represented, yet the women absorbed each lesson with intense focus because practical communication had value regardless of political ideology. Simple phrases like please and thank you came relatively easily to most of them, the basic courtesies that existed in some form in every language. But when Aya tried to teach them how to say I am grateful, several of the women struggled with something deeper than pronunciation. The concept itself seemed to create confusion, because how could you feel or express gratitude toward your captors? The idea seemed to invert their entire understanding of how the world was supposed to work, and yet the evidence of kind treatment was all around them in forms that could not be denied or explained away. A woman named Keiko raised her hand during the lesson, her face troubled as she spoke rapidly in Japanese. She asked Aya whether it was morally wrong to feel something other than hatred when they were being treated as though they were human beings, deserving of basic dignity. The question seemed to hang in the air of the classroom like incense smoke, visible and substantial, despite being made of nothing more than words and the emotions behind them. Around them, the other women stopped their quiet side conversations and waited to hear how Aya would respond, but she had no answer to give them because the question touched on contradictions she had not yet resolved in her own mind. They had been taught to expect torture and starvation and humiliation, systematic cruelty designed to break their spirits along with their bodies. Instead, they received portions of food that actually filled their bowls, medical care when the children developed fevers or suffered minor injuries, and guards who stepped aside respectfully when the women needed to pass through corridors. The cognitive dissonance was profound enough to be physically uncomfortable, like trying to hold two opposite truths in your mind simultaneously. As evening approached and the women prepared small notes of thanks that they planned to send with the guards to whoever was responsible for various kindnesses, Aya found herself writing carefully in both Japanese and English. The act of writing felt like constructing a bridge between worlds that she had never imagined could coexist in the same reality. On one side of that bridge lay everything she had been taught from childhood about American cruelty and barbarism, lessons reinforced by years of propaganda and wartime rhetoric. On the other side of the bridge stretched this bewildering daily experience of hamburgers served on actual plates rather than thrown on the ground, Coca-Cola that fizzed cold and sweet against her lips, and men in uniform who addressed her as Mrs. Tanaka, as though her dignity and identity mattered to them. She folded the note with hands that no longer trembled quite as severely as they had on that first terrifying day when the ship had docked and they had walked through the gates expecting the worst. Perhaps, she thought as she placed the folded note aside, the most dangerous thing about this place was not the guards or the fences or even the uncertain future that awaited them. Perhaps the most dangerous thing was hope itself, that treacherous emotion that seemed to be growing quietly in the fertile ground of unexpected mercy. The 4th of July arrived with heat that made the air shimmer above the concrete pathways crisscrossing the camp, but inside the mess hall something remarkable had taken place overnight. Red and white and blue bunting had been hung from the walls and ceiling, transforming the utilitarian dining space into something that resembled a festival hall more than a prison cafeteria. Aya stood with a group of other women near the serving line, watching in amazement as camp staff arranged long tables that were being loaded with food in quantities that seemed to belong in a dream rather than in any reality she recognized. Fumiko stood beside her, whispering questions that were really just expressions of disbelief disguised as questions, asking whether what they were seeing could possibly be real. Her eyes were wide as she took in the sight of hamburgers stacked high on large platters, their sesame seed buns golden and perfect under the fluorescent lighting that illuminated the hall. Beside the hamburgers sat enormous bowls of potato salad, ears of corn on the cob that glistened with melted butter, and long rows of Coca-Cola bottles standing in metal tubs that had been filled with ice to keep the drinks cold. Keiko was translating quietly for those women whose grasp of English remained limited, her voice carrying a note of wonder that she was trying unsuccessfully to suppress. She explained that the guards had told her this was their Independence Day, a celebration of freedom, and that they wanted the Japanese women and children to join in the festivities. The invitation felt surreal in ways that were difficult to articulate, because what kind of captors invited their prisoners to celebrate national holidays with them? Midori was clutching her two sons close to her sides, one hand on each small shoulder, and the boys were looking upward at all the decorations with expressions of curiosity rather than the fear that had marked their early days in the camp. The younger boy Hiroshi had actually grown bold enough over the past weeks to smile at some of the guards, though he still pressed himself against his mother's leg whenever they approached too close or spoke directly to him. Sergeant O'Connor appeared beside their group with his usual quiet courtesy, but today there was something in his manner that seemed warmer than usual, something that might have been genuine pleasure at being able to offer them this experience. He gestured toward the laden tables and told them to please help themselves, that there was plenty of food for everyone and they should not hesitate to take as much as they wanted. He spoke to them with the same careful respect he showed during their daily interactions, as though they were honoured guests at his family's dinner table rather than enemy nationals being held under armed guard. The first bite of hamburger sent a shock of sensation through Aya's entire body, flavours exploding across her tongue in combinations she had never experienced before. The meat was tender and had been seasoned with herbs whose names she did not know, and it sat nestled between bread so soft that it seemed to dissolve the moment it touched her mouth. She had eaten beef perhaps 3 times in her entire life before the war began, and never anything remotely like this. All around her the other women were taking their own tentative first bites, and she could see their expressions shifting from wariness to amazement as the food exceeded every expectation. But it was the Coca-Cola that truly overwhelmed their senses and defences. The first sip brought actual gasps of surprise at the sharp sweetness of it, at the way the carbonation seemed to dance across their tongues like tiny celebratory fireworks. Keiko actually laughed out loud, a sound so unexpected in their current circumstances that several of the guards turned to look in her direction, but they were smiling rather than frowning, clearly pleased that the women were enjoying themselves. Keiko struggled to find English words adequate to describe the sensation, finally settling on telling O'Connor that it tasted like joy, and he nodded with a grin that creased his weathered face into warm lines. As the afternoon wore on and the initial shock faded, the women found their inhibitions beginning to dissolve like sugar stirred into warm tea. The camp had a small band that played folk songs, and some of the women recognized the melodies from radio broadcasts they had heard before the war cut them off from American culture entirely. When the musicians launched into a cheerful rendition of She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain, Keiko found herself humming along almost unconsciously, and then she began quietly translating the words into Japanese for the benefit of the other women who wanted to know what the song was about. The moment that lodged itself most firmly in Aya's memory came when young Hiroshi approached one of the guards with the fearless curiosity that only small children seem to possess. The guard was a freckled young man who could not have been much older than 20, and Hiroshi pointed at the brass buttons on his uniform and said something in rapid Japanese that the guard obviously could not understand. The young man looked confused and uncertain until Keiko intervened to translate, explaining that the boy was asking whether the buttons were made of real gold. The soldier actually knelt down until he was at Hiroshi's eye level, and then he unpinned one of the brass buttons from his sleeve and pressed it into the child's small palm with a gentleness that made Midori's eyes fill with tears she had to quickly blink away before anyone could see. The guard told Keiko to tell the boy that the button was not gold, but that he could keep it anyway, and the simple kindness of that gesture seemed to contain entire worlds of possibility. That evening, when the women returned to their barracks after the celebration had wound down, they carried more than just full stomachs back with them. They carried the impossible weight of joy they had not expected to feel again, perhaps ever, and that joy was complicated and troubling in ways that would take time to process. Aya found herself humming one of the American folk songs as she walked, the melody weaving through her thoughts like a thread connecting two worlds she had believed were separated by an unbridgeable chasm of culture and war. In her cramped sleeping quarters, she opened the small notebook that had become her lifeline to sanity, and she began to write a letter to her daughter, even though she was not sure when or if it would ever be delivered. "My dearest Mariko," she wrote carefully, "today I tasted America, and it was nothing like the bitter poison we were promised it would be." She paused then, with her pencil hovering above the paper, struggling to find words for the experience. How could she possibly explain to her daughter that their enemies had shown them more genuine kindness in 2 months of captivity than they had received from their own government during the final year of the war, when resources grew scarce and compassion seemed to have been rationed along with food and fuel? Outside her window, she could hear the last strains of harmonica music drifting across the camp on the evening breeze, carrying with it the revolutionary idea that perhaps mercy and grace could bloom in the most unexpected places if given even the smallest opportunity. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, and it was delivered by a camp administrator whose face bore the unmistakable weight of words too heavy for ordinary conversation to contain. Aya was in the middle of teaching her English class when the man appeared in the doorway of the makeshift classroom, clutching a clipboard that trembled slightly in his hands, despite his obvious efforts to maintain professional composure. The women fell silent immediately, reading in his expression and body language what their still limited English could not yet allow them to comprehend fully. The administrator began to speak and then stopped, clearing his throat as though the words had gotten stuck somewhere in his passage from thought to speech. He tried again, telling them simply that the war was over and that Japan had surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, visible but not quite real, and the women sat frozen in their chairs, trying to process information that seemed to make no sense. Keiko stood slowly, her chair scraping against the concrete floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the shocked silence. She repeated the word surrendered in English first, and then switched to rapid Japanese, asking for confirmation that Japan had actually lost the war, that their homeland had been defeated. But the second piece of news that the administrator delivered shattered them in ways that the announcement of surrender had not quite managed to do. He told them that 2 cities had been destroyed by weapons beyond anything the world had ever seen before, bombs that harnessed the power of the atom itself to create destruction on a scale that dwarfed anything conventional warfare had achieved. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he said, and the names fell from his lips like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of horror spreading through the assembled women in waves that seemed to have no end. Some of the women had family members living in those cities, sisters and brothers and parents who might have been going about their daily lives when the sky suddenly turned to fire. Others knew people who had been visiting those places for work or who had moved there in the years since the war began. Fumiko collapsed into her chair, with her notebook sliding from nerveless fingers to scatter its pages across the floor like fallen leaves, and the look on her face was beyond what normal grief could account for. Her sister had lived in Hiroshima, worked at a textile factory somewhere near the city centre, and Fumiko was doing terrible mental calculations about distances and work shifts, and the likelihood that anyone she loved still drew breath in a world where such weapons existed. In the days that followed the announcement, the camp took on the quality of a funeral hall where mourning happens in silence because words are inadequate to the task. Women who had been learning to laugh again retreated into themselves, wrapping silence around them like protective clothing. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola that had once seemed like unexpected gifts now felt like mockery, as though they had been tricked into accepting kindness from people whose nation possessed the capacity to erase entire cities from existence. How could they have allowed themselves to find moments of joy and connection while their homeland burned under weapons that turned human beings into shadows burned onto stone? Aya found herself completely unable to write in her diary, staring at blank pages that seemed to mock her previous entries about gardens and English lessons and 4th of July celebrations. Had her acceptance of American kindness been a betrayal of everyone who had suffered and died, she wondered? The questions circled in her mind like vultures waiting for something to die, and she could find no answer that brought any comfort. Each small act of mercy from the guards now seemed tainted with the knowledge of what American hands and American science had also wrought upon the world. Midori's younger son Hiroshi still clutched the brass button that the freckled guard had given him during the Independence Day celebration, but now he hid it beneath his pillow as though it carried some shameful secret that needed to be concealed from view. His mother watched him with eyes that had gone hollow, with a grief too vast for any human container to hold, her protective instincts warring with an anger and sorrow that had no clear target and no possible resolution. How do you explain to a small child that the same nation that fed him ice cream and gave him brass buttons to keep had also turned 2 entire cities full of people into shadows and ash and radioactive dust? The arguments began on the 3rd day after the news had been delivered, sharp whispers in the mess hall that cut deeper than any physical wound could have managed. Some women blamed themselves for accepting the comfort they had been offered, for allowing their hatred to soften and their vigilance to relax into something approaching trust. Others defended the guards who had shown them dignity and kindness, insisting that individual compassion and national destruction could somehow coexist in the same nation, the same war, perhaps even the same human heart. Keiko stopped translating folk songs and teaching the other women the English words to cheerful melodies. Instead, she sat by the fence for hours at a time, staring through the chain links toward a horizon that seemed to hold only uncertainty and questions without answers. When O'Connor approached her with his usual quiet courtesy to ask if she needed anything, she turned away without acknowledging his presence or his concern, as though the bridge of understanding they had built together with careful words and small gestures had crumbled completely beneath the weight of nuclear fire. On a Thursday evening, Aya sat in her quarters with her diary open to a blank page that seemed to be mocking her inability to make sense of contradictions that had become the texture of her daily existence. How could the same people who had called her Mrs. Tanaka and given her chalk for teaching also possess the terrible power to erase entire cities from the map? How could mercy and destruction spring from the same source, wear the same uniform, salute the same flag, speak the same language? She picked up her pencil with the intention of writing something, anything, but then set it down again without having made a single mark on the paper. Outside her window, she could hear Sergeant O'Connor making his evening rounds, his footsteps as measured and respectful as they had always been. But now those familiar sounds carried a different weight, serving as a reminder that kindness and catastrophe could somehow be woven together in ways that simple moral categories could not adequately address. The notebook remained empty as darkness settled over the camp like a physical presence, and with that darkness came the terrible understanding that some truths were simply too complex for words to capture, too vast for the small comfort that written testimony might provide. The war was over and Japan had been defeated, those facts were clear enough, but the reckoning with what it meant to have found humanity and compassion in such unexpected places had only just begun and might never truly be finished. The silence that had fallen over the camp after the news stretched on for 5 full days, thick and impenetrable like fog that refuses to lift even when the sun rises. Aya refused to eat anything except water and plain rice during those 5 days, her body rejecting what felt like participation in some kind of obscene celebration of destruction. All around her, the other women moved through their daily routines like ghosts, their faces carrying the weight of questions that seemed to have no possible answers that would satisfy both heart and mind. It was a woman named Nurse Rebecca who finally managed to break through the wall of grief and confusion, appearing at Aya's bedside on a grey morning when the oppressive August heat had finally broken and left the air feeling almost breathable again. The American woman was perhaps 40 years old, with greying hair that she kept pinned back severely from her face, and her eyes had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough suffering to recognize it instantly in others. She carried with her a simple brown notebook whose cover had been worn smooth by years of handling, and she settled into the chair beside Aya's cot without asking permission because she had the authority of someone accustomed to healing. "Mrs. Tanaka," she said quietly, "I know you have been writing before all of this happened." She gestured vaguely toward the window, as though that single movement could encompass the weight of atomic bombs and unconditional surrender and shattered certainties. She told Aya that her own grandmother had kept a diary all through the influenza pandemic that swept the world after the First Great War, and that her grandmother had said it was the only way she could make sense of living through something that fundamentally made no sense at all. Aya turned her head away because she was not ready to engage with comfort or wisdom or whatever this woman thought she could offer. But Nurse Rebecca continued speaking in that steady voice that carried the authority of someone who had helped people heal from wounds both visible and invisible. The grandmother had written about neighbours who died horrible deaths and about other neighbours who brought soup to the sick even at risk to themselves, Rebecca explained. She had written about doctors who worked themselves to exhaustion saving lives, and about undertakers who raised their prices because they could, about human beings being fundamentally human, which meant they were capable of everything all at once, both the sublime and the terrible, and that recognizing that complexity was the only way to survive with your sanity intact. The notebook lay on the small table between them, like a bridge that neither woman was quite ready to cross, but its presence suggested possibilities. "Your daughter needs to know that her mother survived this," Rebecca said finally, "and she needs to know what survival actually looked like in practice rather than in theory. Not just the big sweeping history that will be written in textbooks, but the small moments and daily choices and the truth of what it felt like to live through it." That afternoon, Aya found herself holding the new notebook Rebecca had left behind, its blank pages both terrifying and oddly hopeful at the same time. She began writing not with grand proclamations or political analysis, but with a simple memory of the expression on young Hiroshi's face the first time he had tasted ice cream. The wonder in his eyes had been pure and uncomplicated, untainted by the knowledge of what atomic fire would follow weeks later. And that moment of innocent joy had been real regardless of what came after. That reality mattered, she thought, even if she could not yet fully articulate why. Slowly and tentatively, the other women began to emerge from the cocoons of grief and anger they had wrapped around themselves for protection. Keiko started humming again, not the American folk songs that now seemed problematic, but traditional Japanese melodies that connected them to a homeland they could barely remember and might not recognize when they returned to it. She taught the younger women songs her grandmother had taught her, and the familiar rhythms seemed to provide comfort that transcended the need for answers to impossible questions. Midori allowed her sons to play with the other children again after days of keeping them close and quiet, though she watched them with a fierce protectiveness that had not existed before the news arrived. When Hiroshi showed his treasured brass button to a new friend, explaining where it came from and who had given it to him, Midori did not take it away or forbid him from displaying it. Instead, she helped him polish the button until it gleamed like a small sun captured in metal form, and when he asked her whether it was wrong to keep a gift from an American soldier, she told him that kindness received was still kindness, even if the hands that gave it had also done terrible things. The moral complexity of that statement was not lost on her, but she was beginning to understand that moral complexity might be closer to the truth than moral certainty had ever been. The preparations for repatriation began in early September, a slow and bureaucratic process involving endless paperwork and medical examinations that would eventually return them to a Japan that none of them could fully imagine anymore. As Aya packed the few possessions she had accumulated during her months of internment, she wrapped the notebook carefully in a clean handkerchief that someone had given her. The pages now held fragments of truth that seemed too precious to risk losing. Memories of hamburger tastes and children's laughter and guards who had chosen restraint and kindness over cruelty, even when their nation had chosen devastation over any form of negotiated peace. On their final evening in the camp, Sergeant O'Connor appeared at the women's barracks carrying a small cardboard box that he set down carefully on one of the tables. Inside the box, wrapped individually in tissue paper with a care that suggested respect for fragile things, were glass Coca-Cola bottles still cold from whatever ice house he had retrieved them from. He told them simply that he thought they might want something to help them remember, and he distributed the bottles with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout their entire time under his supervision. Aya accepted her bottle with hands that shook only slightly, nowhere near as badly as they had shaken on that first day when she arrived expecting torture and starvation. The bottle felt solid and real in her hands, a tangible reminder that complexity could coexist with compassion, that human beings contained multitudes too vast and contradictory for simple judgments or easy categorizations to capture. She would carry it home to show Mariko, along with the notebook and the impossible story that notebook contained within its pages. As the sun set over the camp for the last time, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed too beautiful for a place that held so much complicated feeling, Aya opened her diary to a fresh page and wrote carefully. Today, I learned that the heart large enough to hold love is also large enough to hold contradiction, and perhaps this is simply what it means to be fully human rather than a simplified version of humanity. The ship that would carry them home to Japan cut through Pacific waters that reflected a sky the colour of old pewter, grey and heavy with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that remained uncertain. Aya stood at the rail with her small bundle of possessions held close, the Coca-Cola bottle wrapped carefully beside her diary, both of them treasures that seemed to belong to a different lifetime despite being only days old. Around her on the deck, the other women gathered in small clusters, their voices carrying the tentative quality of people who were learning to hope again but had not quite relearned how to trust that hope would not be snatched away. The Japan they were returning to existed only in fragments cobbled together from letters that made it through censorship and from rumours passed between Red Cross officials who tried to prepare them for what they would find. Cities had been flattened by conventional bombing long before the atomic weapons fell, families had been scattered like seeds on the wind, and an entire nation bent beneath the weight of surrender and occupation by the very forces they had been taught to consider subhuman. Keiko had received word through official channels that her parents in Tokyo had survived the war, but their neighbourhood was completely gone, replaced by rubble and temporary shelters built from whatever materials people could scavenge. Midori clutched her sons closer to her sides, knowing that the grandmother who had promised to care for them during the war had died during one of the final bombing raids on their city, leaving the boys with no family except their mother. Yet as the coastline of their homeland appeared on the horizon like a promise that might or might not be kept, Aya felt something unexpected rising in her chest alongside all the grief and uncertainty. It was not joy exactly, because joy seemed too simple a word for what she felt, but rather a quiet determination born from months of discovering that survival could take forms she had never imagined when she boarded that first transport ship expecting death. The notebook in her bundle contained more than just memories of hamburgers and kind guards and 4th of July celebrations. It held proof written in her own hand that mercy could somehow bloom in the darkest soil, that dignity could be restored even in captivity, that human beings possessed a capacity for grace that transcended whatever uniforms they wore, or flags they saluted, or propaganda they had been fed since childhood. The disembarkation process when they finally docked was chaos mediated by exhausted officials who processed the returning internees with the kind of mechanical efficiency that comes from having done the same task hundreds or thousands of times before. Aya found herself separated from the other women in the maze of paperwork stations and medical examination rooms, her bundle searched and catalogued by clerks who noted each item with bureaucratic precision. One young official held up the Coca-Cola bottle as though it might contain some dangerous secret or contraband material, and he asked her what purpose it served and why she was bringing American products back to Japan. "Memory," she replied simply. "Just memory?" And something in her tone or perhaps in her eyes must have convinced him that the bottle was harmless, because he rewrapped it carefully in its protective cloth and placed it back in her bundle without further questioning or confiscation. The train journey from the port to Kyoto took her through landscapes that bore the scars of war like old wounds that had begun to heal but would never fully disappear. Rice fields had been replanted in places where bombing had not rendered the soil completely unusable, and children played in the ruins of buildings that had once been homes and shops and schools, their laughter serving as a defiant assertion that life persists even when everything seems designed to extinguish it. When the train stopped at small stations along the way, Aya caught glimpses through the windows of American soldiers in their distinctive uniforms, directing reconstruction efforts alongside Japanese workers, and their interactions were marked by the same kind of careful courtesy she had witnessed in the camp, suggesting that perhaps what she had experienced was not an isolated anomaly, but something more systematic. Her daughter Mariko was waiting at Kyoto Station when the train finally pulled in, and she was taller than Aya remembered, wearing clothes that had clearly been mended multiple times because new fabric was still almost impossible to obtain. But her eyes held the same bright intelligence that had always made Aya's heart swell with a fierce pride that transcended circumstances. When they embraced there on the crowded platform with people rushing past them in all directions, Aya felt the months of separation collapse into a single moment of pure reconnection that made everything else seem momentarily irrelevant. "O Kairina's AI," Mariko whispered against her mother's shoulder, the traditional words of welcome home. And Aya held her tighter because home was not a place anymore, but rather the people who mattered most. That evening in the small room they now shared with Aya's mother-in-law, 3 women crowded into a space barely adequate for one, Aya unpacked her bundle, while Mariko watched with the kind of fascination that suggested she understood these objects carried meaning beyond their material form. The sewing kit that Sergeant O'Connor had provided all those months ago drew admiring comments from the older woman, who examined the quality of the thread and pronounced it superior to anything that had been available in Japan during the war years. But it was the diary that commanded Mariko's complete and undivided attention. "You wrote all of this while you were in the camp?" she asked, turning the pages with reverent care as though they were ancient documents that might crumble if handled roughly. "Every day toward the end," Aya replied, "because I wanted you to know what really happened to me. Not the stories that others might tell, or the history that might be written later, but the truth of it, the whole complicated truth as I experienced it." As Mariko read through the entries, her expression shifted through a series of emotions that included surprise and confusion, and finally a kind of wondering understanding. Here in her mother's handwriting were descriptions of hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Yes, but also accounts of guards who had called her mother Mrs. Tanaka when her own government had reduced her to a number on a list. Here were the details of finding grace in the midst of captivity while cities burned in atomic fire, of accepting kindness from people whose nation had brought unimaginable destruction to her homeland. The complexity of the narrative resisted simple interpretation, and perhaps that was exactly the point. Years would pass before Mariko had children of her own, and when she did, she would sometimes read them selected passages from their grandmother's diary. Not to forgive or forget the genuine horrors of war, because those horrors deserved to be remembered and learned from, but to remember that even in humanity's darkest chapters, when evil seemed to triumph over good, individual souls could still choose mercy over hatred, dignity over revenge, hope over despair. The Coca-Cola bottle that was long since empty but had been carefully preserved through decades would sit on a shelf in their home as a testament to possibilities that seemed impossible. It served as a reminder that enemies could become sources of unexpected grace under the right circumstances, that the human heart capable of surviving war was also capable of embracing peace, and that perhaps the most important stories were the ones that refused to fit into neat categories of good and evil, because real life was always more complicated than propaganda wanted to admit.